I should have yelled too.
Do you remember the first time you watched Caddyshack? It feels like a movie that was always just there. Turn on the TV on a summer evening and you'd stumble upon the scowling Judge Smales, the loud, disruptive Al Chervik, Carl Spackler, muttering stories about the Dalai Lama, and a gopher dancing as if it couldn't care less about anyone. We laughed, then forgot as if it were nothing more than a harmless comedy. But the truth is, Caddyshack wasn't created in order, it was born out of chaos. Behind the laughter was a set fueled by drugs. Two leading stars carried a real-life feud and almost completely avoided each other throughout the shoot. And one near-nude scene nearly crossed the line, turning the production into a potential scandal. Below are 20 dark secrets Caddyshack has carried for decades. Things you don't see when you're laughing, but that might make you look at the film very differently. Leave a like before we begin with the first secret. 20. The Caddyshack set ran on drugs. If you only look at Caddyshack on screen, it's easy to think it was a comedy made in a relaxed atmosphere, a sunlit golf course, people behaving as if no rules exist. Back then, that feeling made it easy to believe everything was just acting, that the chaos was an artistic choice. Years later, when those involved began telling the truth, a stark reality emerged. The Caddyshack set functioned like a party that lasted for months. Cocaine, hard liquor, and illegal substances were everywhere, openly and without pretense. Sleepless nights followed one another. Some shooting days began before certain people had even come down from the night before. That atmosphere didn't just exist, it dictated how the film was made. Scenes sprang from spur-of-the-moment impulses. Dialogue was twisted on the spot. The script was shredded by recklessness. For some, it was a creative paradise, wild, uncontrolled, unpredictable. For others, it was a ticking time bomb. Rising tension among the stars combined with non-stop partying steadily eroded discipline on set. The schedule slipped further and further. Decisions were made in a haze. Studio executives watched from afar as a project drifted out of their control. Caddyshack wasn't just filmed in chaos, it was born from it. 19. Bill Murray and Chevy Chase, two stars who didn't want to share the frame.
Sit down, come on.
No, I don't want to stick to anything in here.
Well, here, take this thing off. This is dirty.
No, don't go to too much trouble, please.
In our memory, Carl Spackler and Ty Webb seem to exist in the same comic universe. They talk. They cross paths. They represent two different kinds of irreverence in Caddyshack. But what few people know is that in real life, the two men behind them almost didn't want to stand in the same frame. The roots of this hostility weren't just ego. It began at Saturday Night Live, where Bill Murray was seen as the beloved successor, while Chevy Chase, after leaving the show, carried a sense of being replaced, of being forgotten. When they reunited on Caddyshack, they were no longer simply co-workers, but two comedy icons standing at opposite ends of the fame spectrum. The crew recognized this very early and began avoiding putting the two stars together. As a result, for nearly the entire shoot, Murray and Chase had no scenes together. Only near the end did Harold Ramis realise that this absence was an undeniable hole. Over lunch, Ramis, Murray and Chase hurriedly wrote the shed scene between Carl Spackler and Ty Webb, a scene that had never existed in the original script. The scene was filmed professionally. No arguments, no explosions, but everyone could feel the atmosphere cold, tense and distant. A memorable moment on screen, born from a conflict that was never resolved off it. 18. The near-nude scene that caused a serious behind-the-scenes clash. On a set already flooded with partying, drugs and rules bent daily, there was one moment that suddenly brought everything to a halt. Not because of laughter, but because the final boundary had been touched. It was the near-nude scene involving Cindy Morgan, who played Lacey Underall, a scene written to be sensual, nothing more. Cindy agreed to shoot it under clear conditions as written within scope and according to the agreement. But the Caddyshack set did not operate on the word proper. According to multiple accounts, John Peters, a producer notorious for his reckless temperament, secretly tried to bring a Playboy photographer onto the set, intending to turn the scene into an erotic photo shoot outside the agreed terms. No consultation, no permission, and most importantly, no consent from the actress. Cindy Morgan realised something was wrong almost immediately, and for the first time during the entire Caddyshack shoot, someone truly said no. She objected forcefully. No negotiation, no compromise. The set froze. Two of the few men who stood firmly by her side were Michael O'Keefe and Harold Ramis. No shouting, no threats, but firm enough to force John Peters to back down immediately. The photographer was escorted out. The plan was cancelled. The scene was filmed exactly as originally agreed. The incident left behind a bitter aftertaste, like a chilling warning in an environment accustomed to crossing lines if no one steps forward to draw. One things can slide very far indeed. 17. Bill Murray frequently arrived on set intoxicated.
Gunga, galunga. Gunga, gunga, la gunga. So we finish 18, and he's going to stiff me.
Did you ever feel that Carl Spackler always seemed slightly out of sync with the world around him? He says things that don't quite connect, looks at life with a dreamy stare, and behaves as if everything were part of some strange dream. As kids, we might have thought it was sheer comic genius. The truth is much simpler. Carl Spackler was built almost directly from Bill Murray's real condition at the time. According to many on the crew, Murray frequently showed up on set not fully sober. Instead of correcting it, the filmmakers, and especially Ramis, chose to capture that very state on camera. Most of Carl Spackler's dialogue wasn't in the script. It was spoken on the spot in improvised moments no one knew where would lead. The Dalai Lama stories, the rambling monologues, the disconnected gaze all came from an actor drifting between real life and character. And it was precisely that lack of control that created one of the strangest and most memorable characters in comedy history. 16. The studio required a new star before approving the film. Looking back at Caddyshack, it's easy to feel like it was made with complete freedom, as if everyone was allowed to do whatever they wanted. But the initial reality was the exact opposite. Before a single frame was shot, Caddyshack nearly didn't exist for a very Hollywood reason: it didn't have enough stars. The studio agreed to greenlight the project only if it had names strong enough to guarantee box office appeal. To them, an odd script, a loose structure, and a golf course setting weren't convincing. What they needed were recognizable faces, and so everything revolved around two names, Chevy Chase and Rodney Dangerfield. Chevy Chase, fresh off his rise from Saturday Night Live, gave the studio a sense of safety. As for the role of Al Chervik, once Rodney Dangerfield began making repeated breakout appearances on Johnny Carson's show, the decision was sealed. This role marked the first time Rodney Dangerfield starred in a major motion picture. And ironically, that insurance choice became the irreplaceable soul of Caddyshack. 15. The first cut ran over 4 hours due to uncontrolled improvisation. As a kid, I never noticed that Caddyshack lacked a clear plot. Scenes flowed like disconnected fragments. Characters appeared, disappeared, then returned without explanation. Yet that very messiness gave the film a sense of freedom, as if everything were unfolding right in front of us. In his first turn as a director, Harold Ramis shot an enormous amount of footage that wasn't in the script. The comedy stars constantly improvised, stretched scenes, added dialogue, added actions, and almost no one wanted to stop. When the team entered the editing room, they faced a frightening truth. The first cut was over 4 hours long. There were too many moments that couldn't be placed anywhere. Editing became a nightmare as they tried to assemble a coherent story out of a pile of creative chaos. More than 2 hours had to be cut. The original Caddy storyline nearly vanished. What remained was a loose structure, one that made Caddyshack distinctive, but also led critics to dismiss it as sloppy. The film survived, but the price was chaos preserved on screen. 14. Caddyshack was almost an autobiography disguised as crude comedy. On the surface, Caddyshack looks like a string of meaningless gags stitched together. But look closer, and beneath the crude humour lies something deeply personal. Almost everything in the film comes from real memories. Screenwriter Brian Doyle Murray had worked as a caddy in his youth, and the country club world in the film is nearly a direct replica of what he lived through, wealthy older patrons playing golf as a social ritual. Young caddies standing on the sidelines, observing while dreaming of escape. The characters weren't invented, they were recorded. Even director Harold Ramis admitted that in real life he once accidentally hit someone in a very sensitive spot with a golf ball. A moment of embarrassment that made its way directly onto the screen through the character of Judge Smales. Caddyshack then isn't just a comedy, it's a youthful diary retold through laughter. 13. The chaotic set deeply irritated Ted Knight. You probably remember Judge Smales as the embodiment of order rules and unbearable rigidity. Few people know that off-screen the actor who played him, Ted Knight, was the one who suffered most from the chaos of the Caddyshack set. While the younger cast and crew turned the golf course into a playground of nighttime racing pranks and substance-fueled parties, Ted Knight stood completely outside that world. He wasn't used to it, didn't like it, and didn't hide his discomfort. Tonight, a film set was supposed to be a workplace, not an endless party. In later interviews, he admitted that enduring the noisy, undisciplined atmosphere was extremely difficult. Yet throughout the shoot, Knight remained impeccably professional. No arguments, no blow-ups, no walking off. That contrast, a man representing order placed in the middle of a lawless environment, ended up perfectly reflected in Judge Smales on screen. 12. The final explosion nearly became a real accident. For audiences, the exploding fairway at the end of Caddyshack is a harmless, exaggerated comic payoff. In real life, however, that scene came dangerously close to becoming a serious incident, quite literally. The explosion was filmed near Fort Lauderdale International Airport, and its scale was so large that a commercial aircraft passing overhead mistook it for a real accident. The pilot immediately reported it to air traffic control, fearing a crash or explosion on the ground. For a few brief minutes, the world outside the set reacted as if a disaster were unfolding. It didn't stop there. Multiple sources claim the production never clearly obtained permission from the golf course owners for the explosion. Instead, they allegedly distracted the owners with other activities while the shot was being carried out. It was a textbook example of how Caddyshack was made reckless, rushed, and only fully aware of the danger after the fact. Fortunately, no one was hurt. But in that moment, the line between comedy and real catastrophe had never been thinner. 11. Florida was chosen because it was cheap and the price was the weather.
I'm going to give you a little advice. There's a force in the universe that makes things happen.
On screen, the golf course in Caddyshack looks calm, lush, and almost timeless. But achieving that image came at a very real cost for the production. Although the director wanted a Midwestern feel, Florida was chosen for a very practical reason: low cost. The filming location was Rolling Hills Country Club, now Grand Oaks, and the fall of 1979 was considered a stable time to shoot. In reality, it was anything but. Florida's brutal heat drained the cast physically. All-night partying compounded the exhaustion. The shooting schedule was repeatedly delayed. Then a major storm hit, flooding the set, and forcing production to shut down entirely. After the storm passed, the aftermath was even more unsettling. The floors of the hotels where the crew stayed were covered in earthworms, a strange but very real consequence of Florida's environment. The cheaper location helped the film survive on paper, but in practice it pushed Caddyshack deeper into exhaustion and loss of control, perfectly matching the chaos the film carried from beginning to end. 10. The gopher was originally just a minor character. In many people's memories, Caddyshack is inseparable from the gopher's sneaky, mischievous dancing, as if it knows it's mocking the entire film. Ironically, at the start, it almost didn't exist. The gopher was written to appear in just one scene as a simple hand puppet, a throwaway gag. Only when the first cut was criticised for lacking structure and a central spine did the producers realise they needed something to hold the movie together. And out of that chaos, the gopher was unexpectedly upgraded from a passing joke into the soul of the film, Carl Spackler's eternal nemesis. Most of the gopher scenes were shot after principal photography had ended. Additional tunnels were dug. Edits were carefully planned to create the illusion that the gopher and the actors occupied the same space. A character born out of post-production patchwork, yet one that became an icon. That's the kind of magic that can only happen in a film like Caddyshack. 9. The Baby Ruth pool scene came from a real prank. For many viewers, the Baby Ruth pool scene is iconic. The music stops, panic spreads, and a misunderstanding spirals into absurdity. It feels too stupid to be true, and that's what makes the story behind it even harder to believe. Brian Doyle Murray had witnessed a similar prank back in high school, a candy bar thrown into a swimming pool, triggering a chain reaction that quickly turned into chaos. With little modification, that memory was dropped straight into the Caddyshack script. To avoid legal trouble, the production didn't use the real brand name. Instead, they changed the label to Baby Rut or Baby Runt. If you look closely, you'll notice different versions appearing in the film, a small trace of on-set damage control. 8. The final line was improvised and nearly dismissed as meaningless. When Caddyshack reaches its ending, there's no traditional climax, no lesson, no summing up speech, just an offhand line blurted out,
"Hey everybody, we're all gonna get laid!"
and then the cut to black. That line wasn't in the script. Rodney Dangerfield said it in a moment of pure improvisation, entirely true to who he was. Looking back, Harold Ramis later admitted, "I don't know why I left it in the movie. It makes no sense at all." And he was right. On its own, the line almost ruins the ending's rhythm. It's crude off-key and leads nowhere. But then, something strange happens. The gopher appears dancing to Kenny Loggins' "I'm All Right," gently pulling the audience back into the film's original playful mood. 7. Doug Kenney, a genius behind an ending without laughter. Amid all the chaos and laughter of Caddyshack, one name is often passed over too quickly: Doug Kenney. He was a co-writer, a co-founder of National Lampoon, and one of the sharpest comedic minds of his generation. But by the time Caddyshack was released in 1980, Kenney was no longer standing on solid ground. Negative reviews, personal disappointment, and a long battle with addiction had worn him down. On a trip to Hawaii with Chevy Chase, Kenney disappeared. Days later, his body was found at the base of a cliff. The death was ruled an accident. But for decades, those closest to him have believed it was suicide, a quiet ending for a man who had written so much laughter. 6. Caddyshack lived on beyond the screen. When Caddyshack ends, you might think the story closes with the gopher's dance. But for a film born of chaos, It was never going to disappear neatly. Years passed, the lines were still quoted, the characters still lived in memory. And then Caddyshack found a very strange way to return to real life. In 2001, Bill Murray and his brothers opened the Murray Brothers Caddyshack restaurant chain. Not a museum, not a movie theatre, but a place to eat, talk and laugh at the old jokes again. The menu was filled with familiar names, Noonan's, nachos, Lum's, hummus, like fragments of memory turned into food. The film no longer existed only on screen. It became a piece of cultural memory you could touch, eat and share with others. 5. Behind-the-scenes disputes that lasted for decades. For a film as chaotic as Caddyshack, perhaps the surprise isn't that it caused controversy, but that the controversies lasted so long. In 2011, production manager Rusty Lemoran filed a lawsuit against the filmmakers of the documentary Caddyshack: The Inside Story, seeking $6 million in damages. He claimed the film had defamed him by portraying him as a spy, someone who secretly reported all the on-set chaos back to the studio. If true, that role would have made him a symbol of betrayal within an already fragile collective. The lawsuit was ultimately settled out of court. No definitive ruling, no clear conclusion about who was right or wrong. But that, in a way, fits Caddyshack perfectly. Even decades later, the story behind the film still hangs unresolved with dark corners left unspoken. 4. The role of Al Chervick almost went to Don Rickles. When we think of Caddyshack, it's hard to imagine Al Chervick as anyone other than Rodney Dangerfield. The rudeness, the noise, the non-stop insults feel tailor-made for him. But history nearly took a different turn. Before Dangerfield was cast, the producers had their eyes on Don Rickles, a legend of insult comedy. Rickles was famous for verbally eviscerating his targets mercilessly and without apology. On paper, he was a perfect fit. Everything changed when Dangerfield began making repeated show-stealing appearances on Johnny Carson's program. Audiences loved his loud, raw, uncontrolled energy. The studio saw in Dangerfield something different, not just satire, but a complete demolition of country club etiquette. The role of Al Chervick didn't just become Dangerfield's major film debut. It became the disruptive soul of Caddyshack, a character who follows no rules, just like the way the film itself was made. 3. Bill Murray was originally scheduled for just 6 days. In the original plan, Bill Murray was not meant to be the centre of Caddyshack. He was scheduled for only 6 days in a strange supporting role, a mumbling groundskeeper who appeared and disappeared. Then the cameras started rolling and everything changed. Murray improvised constantly. He spoke lines that weren't in the script, stretched scenes turned silences into bizarre monologues. And instead of stopping him, the production began to call him back for more. From New York, Murray was repeatedly pulled back to the Florida set each time for a few more scenes, a few more ideas. Gradually, the role of Spackler ballooned, not by design, not by structure, simply because no one wanted to cut those moments. By the time the film was finished, Carl Spackler nearly dominated audience memory, even though he was never intended to. 2. The final farewell of Ted Knight and Elaine Aiken. Amid all the loud stories surrounding Caddyshack, some endings happened very quietly. Few people realised that this film was also the final screen appearance of 2 actors, each in a very different way. For Ted Knight, Caddyshack closed the film career of an actor associated with order, decorum and authority. The role of Judge Smales, scowling, domineering and out of place in a collapsing world, accidentally became a perfect farewell. For Elaine Aiken, Caddyshack was also her last appearance on screen. No scandal, no announcement. For both of them, Caddyshack wasn't just a strange project. It quietly, unexpectedly became the end point of an acting journey. 1. A massive success and a disastrous sequel. Despite all the behind-the-scenes chaos, Caddyshack achieved something few expected upon release major box office success. The film earned over $60 million, became a cult classic, and was replayed, quoted, and kept alive in the memories of multiple generations. But that success also triggered a familiar Hollywood illusion that the magic could be repeated. In 1988, Caddyshack 2 was released and almost immediately became a disaster. Only Chevy Chase returned. No Bill Murray, no original spirit, no accidental chaos that had saved the first film. Harold Ramis, who wrote the original draft, bluntly called the sequel terrible. Audiences turned away. Critics showed no mercy. Caddyshack 2 quickly landed on lists of the worst comedy sequels in history. And perhaps that is Caddyshack's final lesson. Films born from chaos cannot be recreated by formula. They can only happen once. Years later, we can still laugh at the old lines, recognise the familiar faces of Carl Spackler, Al Chervik, or Judge Smales, and suddenly understand this. Sometimes cinema isn't born from order, but from the collision of people who don't belong together. And it's those cracks that create an irreplaceable memory. What moment or line from the film left the strongest impression on you? Leave a comment below. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe to continue exploring the hidden stories behind Hollywood's golden age.